This video contains spoilers for Season 2, Episode 5 of Fionna and Cake. You have been warned. Now, this episode is a pretty huge lore episode, so let's just jump right into it. Now, we already got one new character's background, and that is Huntress Wizard, and this time, we get Marshall Lee's backstory, and a little taste as to why he ignores his mother so often. One cool little thing here in Marshall Lee's mother's office space, whatever, is her clock that we can hear ticking. The bat on top of it is supposed to resemble Marceline's bat form. We also see that from a very young age, he was into music, first by tapping on his desk and getting ridiculed and sent out into the world with some money, and secondly, when he goes out and spends this money on some ice cream, it is the human gender-bent version of the Ice King, who we learn is named Simone from the credits, and she's singing a song about loneliness, which makes sense. That is what Marshall Lee is also feeling right now. But one cool little thing here is that Simone has these cats all around her, and I believe these are the representation of the penguins in the Ice Kingdom. And instead of the Ice King playing his drums for the penguins, it's Simone who plays the keyboard for her cats. One of these cats looks to be the non-magical version of Cake, but I could be wrong. And before we cut to the intro sequence, we see a mysterious character lurking behind a bush. And it's none other than the human gender-bent version of the demon guards that we see in the Nightosphere. We know this without seeing his face because of his outfit. It is the same outfit that we have seen him in across multiple episodes now, lurking in the background. Now, the title of this episode is called The Butterfly and the River, and it is some art of a butterfly trapped in a spider web, which makes sense and we will see it later. But as we know in Adventure Time, butterflies are a pretty important thing, most notably it being one of Finn's past lives, and we'll see it plays an even more important role later on in this episode. And the river part in the title card also makes sense, as we see that again in a new mysterious universe. The cup that Cake is holding is very similar to Jake's favorite cup. In fact, it's almost identical except for the flower on it. Again, this is another cool little Easter egg, but the flower on Cake's cup is the dandelion, the same dandelion that Fionna used to make a wish to make her reality canon. This officially begins our journeys with Fionna, Cake, and a talking Huntress Wizard. She drops some knowledge on us about the heart of the forest, and that it's the source of all green magic, and also that every universe has one. And now it's their mission to find this universe's one. And when Fionna just so happens to mention that there is an oldest tree in the city, that's exactly where they end up going. But before we can see them do that, we cut to Gary and Marshall Lee both living cutely inside of Gary's apartment. I just have to give props to Marshall Lee's new voice actor for a second. Although we did not get Donald Glover back, Chris Collins is the new voice actor, and honestly, he sounds just as good. We get our first glimpse of a musical note from him, and it sounds amazing. We get another amazing song towards the end of this episode, but I just have to give props for Chris Collins because it's very hard to replace a well-known voice actor, especially Donald Glover. But going back to them living together, we understand a little why we saw the very first clip at the beginning of this episode in the first place. Gary is starting to do these little tendencies that remind Marshall Lee of his mom. Before we explore any of that further though, Gary actually invites Marshall Lee to finally meet his parents, which will be very interesting to see because, as we know, Princess Bubblegum's parents is technically the Mother Gum, but I have to say they pull it off pretty well. But before we can see them, we cut back to Fionna, Cake, and Huntress Wizard at the oldest tree in the city, and what do you know? It looks exactly like the tree fort. Now, as we know from Fionna and Cake Season 2, Episode 2, where we see the backstory of Huntress Wizard, we know that in order to get powers from the heart of the forest, in order to be imbued with green magic, you have to cut off your hand and place it by the tree, which is exactly what Huntress Wizard tries to do here. It seems that it didn't work, or at least connecting her to the heart of the forest wise, but as we'll see, something else happens. She ends up sensing that this tree has some sort of magic to it and crosses her eyes at it to open a portal, which again we've seen in Adventure Time before and is canonically correct. In the episode Death in Bloom, when Finn and Jake need to see Death bring Princess Bubblegum's plant back to life, they stare at a corner in the wall and go cross-eyed, and the portal opens, and we see that exact same thing happen here. And then Huntress Wizard and Cake both enter this new portal into this new mysterious universe. But again, before we can see them inside of this tree, we cut back to Fionna, who ends up meeting with Flame after they had scheduled lunch previously. And as they're walking through the street, we see some new characters, but one of the coolest is the human gender-bent versions of this universe's Jay Mertens and Little Destiny. They end up in DJ Flame's recording studio, where we see two new characters. The person rapping is supposed to represent the human gender-bent version of one of the Marshmallow kids that we see in the episode Scamps, and the producer, I'm guessing, is supposed to represent the party god. We also see in the background of his studio some pictures of some owls, which most likely represent the cosmic owl, as as we've seen him in season 2, but we haven't seen the clip of him from the trailer, which looks much more interesting. And we also see what looks like a little Hambo keychain, but blue. Don't know why that's here, but it's very interesting. And before we can hear the end of the Marshmallow Kids rap, we cut back to Huntress Wizard and Cake, who are now inside of this tree. Now, the actual inside of this tree almost seems like a universe itself, with these holes all over the walls that once entered brings you to a different point in time in the universe that this tree resides in. Now, the actual inside of this universe slash tree is very interesting and not like anything we've really seen before. Now, there are already 2 inhabitants that live inside of this tree, one being a caterpillar and the other's what looks like tardigrades. Now, why would these 2 creatures be inside of this tree? Well, caterpillars kind of make sense as it's a tree, nature, all that stuff. But as for the tardigrade, I don't really know. They are known for being one of the most resilient creatures on Earth or in the entire universe. I think they can pretty much survive wherever. So why they would be living in here is interesting. We see multiple different times of the exact moment when Fiona's world changed after Simon lost his magic. And we also see points in the future of this universe, specifically after a group of rogue butterflies that ends up taking over the universe 1,000 years later, which is a direct consequence to Cake smashing Ed the Spider. That's right, we see a cameo from Ed the Spider from the episode Web Weirdos, who was about to eat this butterfly, and Cake steps in and saves the butterfly by smashing Ed, which directly leads 1,000 years later to them ruling the world, to which we also see Baby Finn. It looks like he is the sole hero of this point in time in the universe, and he is slaying these mutated butterflies like nothing. This also confirms that Baby Finn will stay Baby Finn forever, and that means that everybody in the baby universe will stay babies no matter how much time passes. But something interesting to note about the butterfly itself. The pattern is actually very familiar. It's Gulb Betty's eyes. Now, like I said before, butterflies are very important in Adventure Time and hold a lot of meaning. So seeing Gulb Betty's eyes as a butterfly is very interesting. And before we can finally see them figure out how this new time-traveling universe place works, we see how the Adventure Time crew handled the human gender-bent version of Princess Bubblegum's parents. And let's just say they did a pretty good job. We also see the human gender-bent version of Nettie being portrayed here, and it's also really good. In this universe, her name is Nellie, and if you remember, Nettie from the original Adventure Time series, he had an upside-down smile, and how they portray that here is just so amazing. It's now a unibrow. They just did such an amazing job. This whole entire scene of Marsha Lee finally meeting Gary's parents is so wholesome, and we finally get a musical note from Marsha Lee. And like I said before, the new voice actor, Chris Collins, does such an amazing job. His voice is absolutely perfect, and they did such a good job at finding someone to replace Donald Glover. The song he sings is the same song that Simone sang at the very beginning of this episode. After Gary and Marsha Lee end up leaving Gary's parents' house, they share a very nice conversation and deal with their problems in a very healthy way. As I said before towards the beginning of this episode and video, some of the things that Gary does reminds Marsha Lee of some of the tendencies that his mom used to do. And after seeing about how much Gary's parents care for him and that he didn't necessarily have that same experience, instead of just hiding his feelings and repressing that emotion, they talk it out, which is something that I think we can all learn from. But we also see 2 little callbacks. The first is that Gary says to Marshall,
"You can make one about how I'm basically your mom."
Now this is most likely a reference to the fact that Marceline wrote 2 songs about how she doesn't like Princess Bubblegum. The first being Woke Up from the Distant Lands miniseries, and the second being I'm Just Your Problem. And the second reference is when they share a nice cute little kiss. It looks very similar to when we saw Princess Bubblegum and Marceline first share a kiss in the season finale. Gary is also wearing the same sweater that we have seen Princess Bubblegum wear before. Now, Huntress Wizard and Cake finally figured out how this weird, mysterious universe inside of this tree works. And it turns out that Huntress Wizard can actually taste the different universes in the water stream. And as we've established this already, these holes in the wall lead to different times in this universe. And when Huntress Wizard tastes the correct timeline, they hop in the stream to get there. But as we know, cats do not like water. So Cake jumps out a little early and ends up a tad bit in the future of this universe. And she sees that Fiona is working for Hannah Abadir, Marshall Lee's mother. Now, in order to make sense of this, we see that in the current timeline, Fionna ends up running into Queenie, who is setting up to demolish the sweet spot, which wasn't their agreement, and their agreement was that she would have the money by the end of the week, and it is not the end of the week. Queenie, being Queenie, is very stubborn and coming up with an agreement, but they do, and now Fionna has to pay $70K for the sweet spot back, and she has till Sunday to get the money. She ends up walking away from the sweet spot looking all happy and accomplished, but as we can see, that swiftly changes. Not only with her facial expression, but the actual color scheme and palette of the episode itself. It changes. Fionna is having a panic attack. She literally clutches her chest. So why do we end up seeing Fionna working for Hannah Abadir? Well, as we know, and as we've seen countless times throughout this season, she is willing to do quite literally anything to help her friends out. So we see that she will end up working for Hannah Abadir, either to use her connections to help stop Queenie, or literally just do it for the money to hopefully have enough by Sunday to buy the sweet spot back. We also get a little confirmation that the human gender-bent version of the demon guard, the person who is currently working for Hannah Abadir, actually is spying on them as he gets caught by Fionna, and it looks like Fionna made him bring her to Hannah Abadir, as we see her show up in Hannah Abadir's big apartment complex, palace, big home thing. But don't you think I forgot about Huntress, Wizard, and Cake, because they finally make it back to the correct timeline. And a couple interesting things happen. First, we see another close-up of somebody regrowing their arm, and we get a close-up of the mark that it left after it grew back. Very similar to how Finn looks at his arm when it grows back in the episode Breezy. And then how Huntress Wizard throws up Cake, almost being born again, and laying in that puddle could be a reference to how Jake was born out of Joshua's head and ends up in a puddle. But once they're back in this current timeline, Cake spots the butterfly that ends up taking over this whole universe 1,000 years later and absolutely goes ham on them, which I think will have some repercussions in the future. And Huntress Wizard is also nude again. Now, if you didn't notice, we have not seen any clips from Ooh at all so far this episode, but we end off with one tiny clip, and that's when Simon ends up using the demonic wishing eye to try and wish Finn back and get rid of his poisoning. This is when we get a cameo of Wishy, the magical wish spirit who lives inside the demonic wishing eye, who we saw in the episode of Bananas. Of course, wishes in Adventure Time often are a monkey's paw, meaning whatever you wish could technically become true but have some drawbacks to them. And as they wish for Finn to come out of his poison coma, Wishy grants their wish by saying that he's become a new man, and that did not mean that he was cured, but it means that he became a new man by wearing a funny disguise. However, once that wears off, we see Finn is getting even worse. Our boy Finn is really not looking good. It looks like this next episode, episode 6, will be a pretty big episode because we cut to the end credits, and as I've said before, the plant that Fionna is watering is supposed to represent Huntress Wizard, although I think it also represents the episode number because, as we can see, there are 5 leaves on the plant now. I apologize for this episode being so late, and I also apologize for not covering episode 4 entirely. I do plan on doing it, but I fell into sort of a rut again. Luckily, episode 4 didn't have a ton of important lore. It did have a couple very important scenes, such as Huntress Wizard's parents, so I do plan on making a video about that, but I just wanted to get this one out as it's the most recent one. So again, I do apologize, but thank you all so much for watching. I do truly appreciate it. But as always, stay adventurous.